Hello and welcome to class number 6 of Decoding PSIR through answer writing series. I hope all of you are doing good and I really hope that your preparation for the prelims examination at least is right on track. Those who are writing the prelims this year on June of 16th, I'm sure you would have been thinking it's right time to focus on the prelims. We'll come back to these videos later. That is also absolutely fine. If you are aiming for 2025 attempt or later than that, then this video is ideally for you. Otherwise, you can join here after the prelims exam is over. As you know, in this series, what do? We try and take up some previous year questions of PSIR, understand that topic in detail, and then see how to write that answer. So we are not just seeing how to write answers of PSIR, but we are also understanding these important topics, because in the theory part especially we see topics from PSIR get asked repeatedly. So there is a probability of questions getting repeated, and that is why it is extremely important for you to know these topics. So on that note, let's see what do we have in store. Today we'll be taking up this question from 2020. The question again from paper 1 part A is comment on the post-colonial theory of the state. Asked in 2020, 10 mark question, 150 words is the word limit. It was the first question, 1A. What do you mean by the post-colonial theory of the state? This is what you have to comment. So let's first try and understand what do you have to know about post-colonial theory. In simple terms, this theory talks about those countries that were under a colonial rule at some point of time. So for example, India was under a colonial rule. Countries such as, let's say, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, most of the African countries, look at other countries in Asia, Vietnam, etc. All of them were under colonial rule at some point of time. Now the colonial rule has ended. Now they're an independent country. But the fact is, even though they are independent, they still are being exploited by the Western countries. This is the idea of post-colonial states. So all these are post-colonial states, means they are not colonies anymore. India is not ruled by anyone anymore. But the policies of the Western world are even today formed in such a manner that they keep on exploiting these countries that used to be once their colonies. That is the entire idea. Whenever you have a question about post-colonial states, so you might have some question about, for example, what are the common features in post-colonial states. So please understand, whenever you have these kind of questions, post-colonial state, etc., think about India. Whatever is valid for India, whatever you see around us in our society, that will be valid mostly to all the other post-colonial states as well. So when you say post-colonial state, when you have a question on that, when you have to write some common features, some interesting ideas about that, please make sure you think from India's point of view, what is valid for India, what happened in case of India, and then you can apply the same in that answer, and that will be good enough. So make sure that you do that. Most of the post-colonial states suffer from a similar kind of a problem. Because these were colonies, most of the economic resources were exploited. Their colonizers, the imperial powers, took away their natural resources as much as possible. They imposed their culture. Like in India, we still have a lot of British culture that has remained. Look at the education system, look at how is it formed. Look at how most of our higher education is not really in our vernacular language. All of this is because of the colonizers, that is the British, being here and adopting these policies. The post-colonial perspective of the state says that post-colonial societies, that is the ones that got independence around in 20th century, like India, they still are developing nations and they have still not gotten out of that entire cycle of colonization. These include usually countries in Africa, Latin America and Asia. You might say that these countries are now independent, but if you look at how the world works, let me give you a very simple example. Look at institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, even the UN Security Council. You will see all these institutions are dominated by the countries that used to be the colonizers, that used to be the imperial powers. Without the US saying yes, you cannot carry out any reforms in the World Bank. Head of the IMF has always been a European citizen. Look at the UN Security Council, doesn't matter what the developing world wants. No resolution can be passed if the developed world or mainly the P5 countries won't agree to it. That is the idea. So we are living in a phase of neo-colonial issue or neo-colonial phase. Now what is neo-colonial? Whenever you prefix the word neo in front of any ideology, neo means new form of. So right now we are living in a phase of neo-colonialism, means the countries in developing world are still colonies only. Just that they are not being openly told that you are colonies of other countries now. Their resources are still being exploited. Let me give you an example. Why is it that most of the pollution comes in from the developing world? Because the developed world is exporting all the dirty activities to the developing world. The developed world does not want to harm their own environment, they don't want to harm their own air, they don't want to create their dirty products themselves. They want to export all of that. They want to outsource all of that rather to the other developing world. That is a new form of colonialism. The Western countries, mainly European countries, they basically made a perception for the world that whatever happens in Europe is the most advanced technology ever. They made this perception, they created a perception that Europe is the center of all the new forms of art and culture, which is not really the case. These colonies in Africa and Asia are still being used for cheap raw material, for cheap labor, because the people in these countries don't have such a high education that they will be able to sustain by themselves. They eventually have to work as laborers. That is why you see a lot of people from Asia, from Africa, from all these countries going to Europe, going to America, working at a very less labor. Most of the low paying jobs, let's say drivers, construction workers in the Western world, are not jobs that are done by the locals there. These are jobs that are done by the people who go from these developing countries to these countries in search for better opportunities. That is again a form of neo-colonialism. Look at some of the best or well-known civilizations from the ancient past. India and Egypt, both of these have had the magnificent history attached to them. But none of these could really realize their complete national consolidation. Countries were divided, India was divided, India was partitioned when the British were here. So the colonial powers made sure that before they left, they made sure that the situation in these colonial countries or situation in these colonies is so bad that they will never be able to achieve their true potential. They created a myth of European supremacy, that whatever happens in Europe is probably the best. This is also known as Eurocentrism. They created a myth that the best culture belongs to Europe, the best art belongs to Europe. You want to see the greatest artists of all time, come to Europe. You want to see the greatest paintings, come to Europe. You want to see the greatest sculpture, come to Europe. That's a myth that they created. If you look at our history, some of the world's best art forms have been created in countries such as India. But take this example. If you are in India, how many times do you go to a museum in India? You would hardly go to any museums in India. But when you travel abroad, let's say you go to France, you will line up like hundreds of people to enter the Louvre Museum. You go to England, you go to London and you want to go to the British Museum. They might have kept everything from around the world, all of that is stolen, including from India. But you don't want to go to the museum that is in India, but you would want to go to a museum when you're outside. Why? Because this aura has been created of Europe being the center of all this technology, literature, etc. This myth of racial supremacy was created by the Europeans, which helped them in colonizing these colonies. They spread this idea of white man's burden, which you read in history. White man's burden means people such as Rudyard Kipling, they try to justify why British and the French, etc. are ruling over the other parts of the world. Their idea was that British are not ruling over the other parts of the world because they want to. They said that it is because the God wanted them to go to different parts of the world, train other people, give them more knowledge and bring them to modern world. So they called it white man's burden. It is a burden of the white man to go and teach and train other people. That is again the idea that they propagated. In India also, we know the entire debate of our education system. When Lord Macaulay was able to impose the English form of education system in India in 1835, where he wanted to create in India a class of brown white men educated in European culture and making sure that they regard Europe as the supreme center of power. All these are components of the post-colonial theory of state. That is how post-colonial states are. This is what you have to compress in this particular question. So again, the question was comment on the post-colonial theory of the state. As I told you earlier, these are short questions. Question number 1 in PSIR has 5 parts basically, where you have to write 10 marks answers. These are 150 words each. You have to write a short note. When you say comment, you just have to write a short note rather than thinking about an introduction, main body, conclusion. Just summarize whatever we have read about this post-colonial theory. So this is not really a new theory of the state. It is about analyzing how newly independent states exist. When I say newly independent, what we mean to say is the ones that got independence in 20th century. Newly independent doesn't mean got independent just now. It just means got independence in, let's say, 20th century. So their idea of how they are still being controlled by the major powers in the world, now indirectly through institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, UN, etc., that make sure that any prosperity of the third world or any prosperity of the developing world only happens after developed world has said yes. Then you can write names of certain thinkers who have talked about how a new international economic system should be created and how the underdeveloped countries should be allowed their own development. This is what you can write about how they created Europe as the hub, or a myth that Europe is the hub of all the cultural supremacy. They call it the white man's burden. This is how you have to write this particular answer. Again, theory-based questions are repeated very, very often in PSIR. So understanding these type of topics will really help you write these answers. Again, these are very short essay type of answers, a very short essay or a shrunk essay. Just 150 words and 10 marks is what you will get over here. This was our session for today. As you know, this class comes up at 4 p.m. on Monday, Wednesdays and Fridays. Do watch out for the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Do hit the subscribe button as well. Jai Hind.